In the 1800s, Zanzibar was known as the Spice Island. It was the global hub for cloves, and a major port for ivory and slaves. It lay just off the coast of modern-day Tanzania, and for centuries, it had been under Arab control, ruled by the Sultan of Oman. By the middle of the century, however, European colonial powers had turned their eyes toward Africa. The so-called scramble for Africa was underway. Britain and Germany were racing to claim territory, not just for economic reasons, but for power, prestige, and influence. Zanzibar, strategically located along the East African coast, became a key prize. In 1890, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty was signed. Germany agreed to recognize Zanzibar as a British protectorate in exchange for Britain recognizing German control over mainland Tanzania, known then as German East Africa. From that moment, Zanzibar fell under British influence, though technically, it still had its own sultan. The British supported Sultan Khalid bin Barghash, who ruled Zanzibar from 1893 to 1896. Hamid was cooperative. He accepted British presence, British advisors, and British trade. He maintained peace and stability. But on the 25th of August, 1896, Sultan Hamid suddenly died, likely poisoned. Almost immediately, his cousin, Khalid bin Barghash, seized power and declared himself the new sultan. He did this without British approval. To the British authorities, led by Sir Basil Cave, this was an act of defiance. They had another candidate in mind, Hamad bin Mohammed, a man far more loyal to British interests. Within hours, the British consul sent an ultimatum to Khalid. He was to step down, leave the palace, and renounce his claim, or face military action. Khalid refused. Khalid barricaded himself inside the palace complex, a grand structure along the seafront, fortified with thick stone walls. Inside were about 2,800 men, many armed with rifles and muskets. He also had several artillery pieces and a royal yacht armed with a few small cannons. Outside the palace, British naval forces began to assemble. In the harbour of Zanzibar town were several Royal Navy ships, HMS St. George, the flagship, commanded by Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, HMS Philomel, HMS Raccoon, HMS Thrush, and the gunboat Sparrow. The British ships had modern naval guns, far superior to anything the Sultan's forces possessed. Still, Khalid seemed confident. He believed the British were bluffing. After all, no one could imagine a war lasting less than an hour. At 8 a.m. on the 27th of August, Basil Cave sent a final message to Khalid. It was simple and direct: if you do not lower your flag and surrender by 9 a.m., we shall open fire. Khalid's reply was short: we have no intention of lowering the flag. As the clock ticked towards 9, the harbour filled with tension. Civilians fled the area. The smell of gunpowder hung faintly in the humid air. On board the British ships, gunners prepared their positions. The crews were silent, waiting for the order. At 8:59 a.m., the British raised the signal flags. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the order was given. The British guns roared. The first shells hit the palace, shattering the wooden supports and setting it ablaze. The massive structure, built mostly of wood and stone, caught fire almost immediately. Khalid's men tried to return fire with their antiquated cannons, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Within minutes, the palace walls began to crumble. The Sultan's armed yacht, the HHS Glasgow, attempted to fire its small cannons toward the British ships, but it was quickly sunk. By 9:15 a.m., less than 15 minutes after the bombardment began, the Sultan's forces were already breaking. Smoke and fire engulfed the palace. The defenders fled or were cut down. By 9:40 a.m., the shelling stopped. The British flag was raised over the remains of the palace. The war was over. It had lasted 38 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the destruction was immense. The palace lay in ruins, the harem and treasury burned to the ground. About 500 Zanzibaris were dead or wounded, many of them palace guards and civilians caught in the crossfire. On the British side, one sailor was injured, and that was the only British casualty. Sultan Khalid had fled the palace during the bombardment, escaping through a back door to seek refuge at the German consulate. The Germans refused to hand him over, and later smuggled him out of Zanzibar by sea, disguised as a servant. the British installed Hamad bin Mohammed as the new sultan. Under his rule, Zanzibar effectively became a puppet state, entirely under British control. A few years later, Britain forced the abolition of slavery, one of Zanzibar's most profitable but brutal trades. Though it lasted just 38 minutes, the Anglo-Zanzibar War was a reflection of a much larger story, the age of imperialism. The war wasn't really about who ruled Zanzibar, it was about demonstrating British authority. It was a message to the world, and to Africa, that defying the empire came with swift, merciless consequences. It also showed how technology and industrial power had shifted the balance of warfare. Wooden ships and cannons from the old world were no match for steel cruisers and modern artillery. The battle marked a turning point, the end of an era where local rulers could challenge imperial might. Sultan Khalid bin Barghash lived in exile for many years. In 1916, during World War I, the British captured him in East Africa and sent him into exile once again, this time to the Seychelles, and later to St. Helena, the same island where Napoleon had died. He eventually died in 1927. Sir Basil Cave, the British consul who issued the ultimatum, continued his diplomatic career and was later knighted for his service. Rear Admiral Rawson, who led the bombardment, went on to command further operations in Africa. For the people of Zanzibar, however, the war left scars. British influence deepened, and for decades, the island's affairs were controlled by the colonial administration. Today, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is often remembered as a curious footnote in history, a fun fact about the world's shortest war. But behind that statistic lies a darker story. It was not a duel between equals. It was an imperial punishment, a reminder of how empires could destroy a nation in less than an hour. It also raises a broader question about how power was exercised in the colonial world. What does it say about the nature of empire when diplomacy ends in less than 40 minutes of gunfire? If you were standing on the docks of Zanzibar that morning, you would have seen smoke rising, flames consuming the palace, and the Union Jack fluttering in the wind. In that moment, one world ended and another began. From then on, Zanzibar would never again rule itself freely. The age of sultans gave way to the age of empire. And so, the shortest war in human history, a war of just 38 minutes, became a symbol of the vast, unequal power struggles that shaped the modern world. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed learning about this extraordinary event, please consider subscribing for more documentaries about forgotten moments in history. There are countless stories like this one, brief, fascinating, and full of lessons about power, ambition, and humanity. Until next time, I'm your narrator, and this was the shortest war in history, the Anglo-Zanzibar conflict of 1896.